We recently did a shoot in Malibu, California, and this was a much more commercial production where we were taking footage that would later be cut up into digital ads or digital commercials to run online. And unfortunately, I can't show anything from the shoot itself because of legal reasons. That was one of the requirements. They didn't want to show any of the behind the scenes or social posting, but I'm free to talk about it in kind of a loose general sense and maybe give you some advice or tips on things to keep in mind if you have a production that's similar in the future. This was a bigger production than is common for your typical video production type person, but certainly small in the commercial type space. This was primarily a photo shoot for a national campaign they were putting together, and we were along to do video as a kind of an accompaniment, as a side kind of add-on at the end, which was interesting because you're coming along as someone shooting video and you have to work with someone you don't know who's shooting photos, and they're the main person. They're the star, right? They get to pick the shots. They get to call the shots. You say what's what, and you're just kind of along for the ride. But with video, there are certain requirements and different parameters you're trying to meet as compared to photography. So the first thing I asked was, are you planning to shoot natural light, continuous light? Are you going to be using strobes or speed lights or anything like that? And thankfully, this was an outdoor shoot and the photographer was only using natural light, which made me really happy that I didn't have to deal with strobes or flashes or anything like that, because that just gets a lot messier when you're doing video for obvious reasons. And we weren't recording any audio, so that made it a little bit easier in terms of the setup and the gear we needed. But we were shooting outside, natural light, and I wanted to make sure we got the best possible footage for this because it's commercial type quality, and shooting in lighting conditions like that, you want to make sure you're capturing the most dynamic range possible. But we were still working with a moderate budget for this one, but we were able to rent an FS7, which was the kind of the right camera that fit in that nice sweet spot of not being overkill, something like getting an Alexa, which that's not to say it wouldn't be usable or valuable. An Alexa would absolutely be valuable, or like a Red Epic, that'd be great, but it just wasn't there in terms of the budget. So I was trying to finding that kind of where's the threshold, what's going to be the most valuable thing we can have. And the FS7 was a fantastic camera to work with. I used it previously, but not too often, so it was good to get my hands on it again. And I really like using that camera. The menus are absolutely dreadful. Sony has a real problem with their menu system, but the images look fantastic, and it was great to be able to get that little bit extra dynamic range, extra quality out of it that you're not going to get from something like a GH4, which is what we typically shoot with on some of the other projects that are lower budget. And oftentimes those projects, you need to capture a lot more footage. So if you're shooting something like a documentary or interviews or testimonials or something like that, where you're capturing hours of footage, or maybe a live event, a concert, something like that, you get hours to go through, multiple cameras, you're going to get it's going to take up a lot of hard drive space. With this, we're shooting much more smaller segments. We're only doing the one main cam, our cam A. We did roll on a GH4 as our cam B on a Ronin M to be precise, but the main camera was the FS7. And so we were able to, roll on the smaller, shorter clips and not worry so much about taking up a whole hard drive or two just in raw footage. So that was nice, but you're still kind of juggling card space and dealing with, how often should you be recording, what should you be recording. I ended up shooting 4K 60, which is a nice feature that you can shoot on the FS7 to get kind of that slow motion element to it. Certainly not super slow motion like you can get with a Phantom or even some of the higher frame rate modes on the FS7, but 4K 60 is really nice feature to have because as you know, if you've watched my other videos, I think 4K is definitely the way you should be shooting if you can, and having the extra frame rate there as an option to slow down in post was important because of the fact that we were shooting with the photographer, and I was kind of worried that we'd only be getting little clips, seconds of good material while the photographer was posing or the model was doing something else. And I wanted to make sure that if we got 3 seconds of footage that I could extend it to 6 or something like that. You know what I mean? So that it wasn't just about capturing the 2 seconds. It's like, okay, now because it's slow motion, because we can extend it, we actually get a little bit more out of it and really maximizing that time of good footage. Because it's really hard when you're shooting in a space where you're not the lead person getting precisely what you need. Now, back to working with the photographer, it was a it was great. Photographer was fantastic, easy to work with, got along great, and we were able to make sure he got what he needed, but we were also able to get the video footage that we needed. And there were tricky situations where maybe a particular video shot was not exactly the angle I'd like it to be at because the photographer was at that spot, or maybe vice versa. I don't know. I didn't get to really talk to him afterwards to see how he thought it went, but in any case, those small things like being shifted off a couple degrees on your angle or something, that's probably down to me being nitpicky and striving for that perfection of like, okay, what I think looks best, where your average person maybe watching it wouldn't know the difference. Maybe they would. I don't know. We'll see when the final product rolls out and how it all looks. But the stuff we were able to capture looks really, really good after going through the raw footage. FS7, again, I can't sing its praises high enough. It's a great camera, especially for something that does punch kind of above its weight class in terms of competing on that Alexa Red Epic stage, but still being affordable enough. We rented it from Lens Rentals. I'll give them a shout out. Why not? I use them pretty frequently, but I've also used the other ones, Lens Pro to Go, borrow lenses. I basically just rent from whoever's got it cheapest and can get it to me in the time I need. So I don't really have a particular preferred vendor for rentals, but it is nice to be able to get that stuff for a few days, usually for prices that, if you're renting something locally, you might be paying for like a day rate, where Lens Rentals or some of the online places usually give it for a couple days because of the whole shipping situation. So they're sometimes more generous. It just depends. You kind of have to check around and feel it out and see what works best for you. But other than that, it was a full day of filming. Sorry again that I can't really show you any of the footage. It was basically a combination of using the sun either as a key light and shooting it through diffusion, if you will, or using it as an edge light and then kind of bouncing light back. There are plenty of tutorials online of how to shoot with natural light and using the sun as your kind of main primary, your one light source, if you will. So you can check those out. Maybe we'll make one at some point, but I don't know that I do it in any way particularly different than anyone else, other than I would primarily use the sun as an edge or as a key. I'm trying to think of another way to do it. I guess, you could shoot in the shade, but that's usually pretty limited in terms of what you can have as your background and what you can have as your subject and your angles. That gets really tricky. So I usually tend to avoid shade. I know a lot of wedding photographers who use shade as their kind of main way of doing things for some particular shots, but I just find it kind of limiting. So with a camera that gets that extra dynamic range, using the sun as an edge or as your key light is usually the way to go. And it was a nice clear day. Unfortunately, that's not always the best in terms of lighting, but because it's a little bit later in the year, winter time here in North America, then the sun was a little bit lower. So we never got that like straight above sun, which was actually really nice. So we were always able to kind of put it on axis a little bit as an edge, which I think I prefer that footage better, using the sun as an edge light and then bouncing back in to fill in the face or any features, if it's a close-up on hands or whatever it might be. So that was kind of the process. And then in terms of lenses, I used the 70-200 Canon f2.8 with the Metabone Speed Booster. I don't know what version it was on, like the S version 4 or something like that. They've come out with a bunch of iterations on those speed boosters. So I use that on the FS7 because the FS7 is a super 35 millimeter sensor. Speed booster gets you to a full frame like equivalent type look, which is really nice that you can do that with a lens adapter like that, and didn't have any problems using the adapter. I know a few people have run into issues where like lens communication or you getting weird flaring or ghosting or whatever it might be. Didn't run into any of that, but that might also just be the way we were shooting. We weren't shooting directly into any light, so that might be something to consider. And for support, I was just on sticks with the FS7, and then like I said, we had the GH4 on a Ronin M to do some kind of gimbal work, get a little bit of movement in there. And with the GH4, we were also using a speed booster and using the Canon f1.2. Not shooting it at 1.2, we had to throw an ND filter on there and stop down just a little bit, but that's usually better anyway when you're shooting with a gimbal, just because you want to keep things in focus and you don't want to be hunting, which is next to impossible unless you're very, very talented and have the setup to do it. But We opted to shoot a little bit deeper depth of field, so around f4, f5.6 with an ND filter. On the FS7, it's nice because you got the built-in ND filter, which I kind of almost forgot about at the beginning. I was like, oh, I got to throw an ND filter on. I was like, oh, wait, no, I don't. I've got the internal one. That's really nice. And another problem with the FS7 is that the way you adjust the aperture on electronic lenses is not the most reliable. I mean, it works, but it's kind of like fiddly. You have to be very precise and slow with your adjustments. Otherwise, it'll take a while for it to catch up. You'll scroll way down or scroll way up, and it kind of ticks through at what seems like a random pace. But that's one of those things, like, you can work around it. I'm trying to think of other problems with the FS7. It's really just the menus and navigation. And, when you change the codec or the system format, you've got to restart the camera. And it doesn't start up very quick, certainly faster than other cameras, but there is a little bit of a weight to it. So it's not like you can just switch it to like a different mode and then be up and running really quick. That's kind of a problem. But I was using the viewfinder with the LCD, which worked great. No problems there, and had it also used it as like the shoulder rig configuration with the hand grip, and that worked really well as well. So no issues there. I really like using that camera. It's great, especially considering the price. So if you haven't used an FS7, I definitely recommend you check it out if you can get it. Stop by a rental shop, play around with it, or maybe rent it for a project, maybe borrow it from a friend who's got one. They're really not that expensive in terms of, people who do video production for a living. But at the same time, I kind of usually try and stay away from cameras that I know I'm not going to need all the time, because the thing with cameras is you buy them, and the more expensive camera you buy, the longer maybe not the longer, but the more important it is you get the return on the investment. So sorry this video is going so long. Hopefully this is valuable stuff. But my point is, if you buy a camera that's, say, like a $50,000 camera, you've got to get at least $50,000 worth of work to pay it off. And it's probably double that, because you need to live. You need to pay your bills. You need to eat food. You need to, own a car to get around. All those things. So you really have to kind of double your investment, because you need stuff to live off of, and you have to pay off what the camera was. So if that takes you a year, that's great. But if that takes you 3 or 5 or 10 years, what I've seen people do is they make an investment in a really expensive camera, and because they're not able to pay it off, or they're not getting that return on investment as quickly as they need, they end up being locked into that system or that format. And you'll find these people who become fanboys, or they don't advance with time. I'm sure you've met people who are still shooting on some what feels like ancient format, whether it's like beta or like DV cam or just some old school format, and they're not updating and adapting because in their mind they made this huge investment back when those cameras were really, really expensive, and it doesn't make sense for them to buy the new, latest, greatest expensive thing because they're still trying to pay off that old thing, or they just feel like it was too much to invest in that old system, so they don't want to abandon it. And in regard that you get stuck with like 1080p, or they can't do high frame rates, or the dynamic range is limited, or they can't do low light stuff. And it just makes all these problems because you're not keeping current with the current trends. And you'll see this, with people, someone go out tomorrow and buy a $50,000 camera, and yeah, they'll have the latest and greatest for this year. But what happens 5 years from now when, technology advances and they're still worried about that $50,000 they sunk into those cameras? So in a roundabout way, that's to say that technology advances so fast that I really am a proponent of kind of renting the things that you don't need all the time. Obviously, I own a GH4, and we shoot on the GH4 all the time because it covers almost all the bases in terms of being 4K, being able to do some slow motion stuff with 1080 p60, but still keeping the codec, the file size is a little bit smaller, so we're not eating up hard drive space. We can continuously record. We can do all those great things I've talked about a million other times with that camera. But then on the occasion where it's like, okay, we need something a little bit higher end, we need something that does a specialty thing, whether it's a Phantom, an Epic, an Alexa, or an FS7 in this case, we just rent it out, because even though it feels like you're wasting money on the rental because you're not getting anything tangible, you're also not making that huge investment in something that you're not using every single day. And that's not to say the FS7 you wouldn't be able to pay it off. It's like a $10,000 camera, maybe a little bit more, all rigged out with memory cards and whatnot. But that's not cheap for your indie shooter or your person who's just getting started. So maybe it's a kind of a second or third step up on the rung of like where you'd work up. Maybe you'd start with like a GH4 or like an A7S2, something like start there, and then you can work your way up. But really those cameras, the cheaper ones, I think end up getting more work because you're also running the problem of people who, they buy an Epic or they buy an Alexa or something like that, and then they feel like they can't do the small productions because it's like, oh, well, that's beneath me. It's not worth it to, go work for you for the day because you can't even pay what the camera would cost to rent. So I'm not going to do that. Or they just feel bad about it. And I think that's like an awkward situation to be in because I think, if you're not working and there's work to do, I think you should probably take the opportunity to do it unless you just work, all the other days of the year and that's the one day you have off. Then in that case, I guess that's fine. But having those cheaper cameras that you own and then the more expensive stuff you rent, I think that's just a good way to go about it. But again, sorry, I didn't have any footage to show from this behind the scenes. But if you have any questions or comments about anything I said, feel free to ask below. I'm happy to respond to them and maybe give you a little bit more insight in a particular thing that we did. I tried to cover it all, but I'm sure I missed something. So if you have a question, just ask. I'm happy to answer it.